Good afternoon, everyone. You're all very welcome to Wednesday's US Market Open. Looking at the primary pieces of volatility, obviously overnight, and of course, really looking ahead to the trading day in question. So, yesterday, obviously, we talked about the presence of a lot of linear data prints over the next, obviously, couple of days. Really looking for clarification on the shutdown in the US, of which we're still yet to do. And of course, in the midst of some of the earnings like Palantir, which disappointed yesterday. So where we currently stand today, again, markets overall, data prints, they have not been bad in Europe. The PPI numbers were lower, in line on the year on year and slightly higher on the month on month. The German composite PPI, PMI and services PMI both came out actually quite well. And we've seen a little bit of a counteraction this morning. So we had obviously pre-market selling in Europe overnight in the Asia session in the German DAX. But overall markets since has kept above that 23,750 level on price structure rather than obviously trying to break through and propel lower. So really markets in a status quo in Europe. On the higher time frames, the 1 hours, the 4 hour prints, the DAX is holding strong. The FTSE is getting higher, so we talked about it last night. Really, would we see a market breakdown? We saw a temporary break, funnily enough, during Asia, like with the DAX, but we also got an immediate filtration back into the value area, and even on this morning London Open, got above it, held above it, and kicked on ultimately. So really, at this point, it's all eyes on structural price dynamics to see whether we get this kick forth in progression. The DAX off the lows, the FTSE really to go to new highs again. But as I said, Thursday really with the Bank of England is going to determine whether we get impetus on the upside or downside in the likes of the pound and the FTSE and the crosshairs of that. So overall, you'd actually have to say European assets is quite solid overall. So obviously, despite that pre-market sell-off overnight. And of course, in the FX markets, what are we seeing? Well, we're getting that dollar picking up. So we talked about this short-term high here yesterday from July. We are trying to break through it. As I said, really all eyes to see how progressive we get on the upside of the DXY. Now, taking a step back, and something I didn't mention last night, but looking at it, really, as I said, all eyes of whether that DXY and dollar index as a whole gets up into that 50-week moving average. So 50-week moving average is a fairly good barometer for kind of average price action. As I said, it looks at the average price over the last 50 trading days, and that DXY as a whole is 101.70. So even at that, there is the potential to see that kick on higher. So from my perspective, the short-term bullishness of the dollar will probably create kind of a lagging effect in the likes of the S&Ps, the NAS, the Dow, and some of those risk-denominated assets as we talked about last night. But as I said, from my perspective, really interesting to see how does that develop. As I said, not just today, but over the coming days. Now, on the short time frame trading session, we got above those July highs. So this is obviously the July highs here. There was a period of consolidation last night into it. We got above it this afternoon, or early this afternoon into the open, and we're getting a little bit of a counteraction there back in. So even from that perspective, taking the SMA out of it for a moment, you're really looking at how does price structure react. And as I said, for me, that's going to be around this 100 to 100.2 barometer. So this area of price here must hold today in order for that dollar, I think, at least in the short term, even to get that next leg higher up into 101. So do keep an eye on that one. As I said, even from Monday on the shorter time frames, obviously that aggressive move on Friday, elongated consolidation on Monday, breaking up, breaking back down, holding structure in that 99.750, gapping higher yesterday, taking new highs, coming back down, holding it, and then incrementally gaining positivity, as I said yesterday, into that 100.2 handle for where we've just broken out from today. So short time frame structure, still very much bullish trend. Again, that would mean that euro dollar is just kind of biting back against a short-term breakdown. So obviously yesterday, short-term breakdown into value area, revised value area. Today, value area, short-term breakdown, price actions moving back into it. So that 115 handle is going to be kind of the short-term ceiling for kind of upside progression. If we were to break above it, you're really looking at price action going beyond 115, and then you're kind of looking at 115.25, 115.50, etc. So from that perspective, keep an eye on this today if you're day trading. So for me, that kind of as I said, 114.90 into 115 is a fairly good barometer. We've broken lower this morning, and you can even see how we've got that breakaway thin volume down here, price action moving back into value area. So that, as I said, 114.90 handle is going to be very interesting today. Same again with cable. We got that really aggressive sell-off on, and that is how does that GBP USD react around that value area. And as I said, that 130 handle into kind of 130.25 is your structural benchmark lows. But I'm kind of indirectly worried about the fact that we've broken up initially today. We've got a counteraction. We've gone back in. We've created like a top formation on the high of the day and refused to break through, which means that there is a little bit more of trepidation on upside buying on cable, despite, as I said, number of days of rapid selling. So you only have to look at the selling on Tuesday and look at the pretty clear and consistent selling from the middle of last week, from last Tuesday, when we went from 134 or 133.50 down into that 130 handle, of which we visited yesterday and today. So keep an eye on that one. That 130 is the benchmark low. If that breaks away, you're really then looking at that dollar breaking, retesting, holding, maybe coming a little bit wicky on the lower, but ultimately trying to push through and kick on. So that's the bias there for the likes of euro dollar cable in validation on further downside progression. Okay, in terms of the S&Ps, very interesting here as well. Price structure, as we talked about it yesterday, so this is the S&Ps that kind of elongated support, short-term support around the 68.25s, which was under last Monday's value low, or even low of the day. And then, of course, yesterday, aggressive breakdown, dead cat bounce into value area. And then, of course, we broke through pre-market. So, interestingly enough, last night, S&Ps, German DAX, FTSE, all selling off on some of that kind of news, data, etc. late last night. So between kind of 11 and 2 a.m. UK time, we did get that flashback, and then we've seen markets move back. And of course, that's exactly what the S&Ps has done. It's moved lower indirectly. It's got back into kind of yesterday's value area, but it's still holding underneath yesterday's value area below 6,800. So that's going to be kind of the short-term ceiling as well. I think if we were to break 6,800, you probably get another kind of, like yesterday, short-term spike up, and then you're looking to see, does that actually ultimately continue after it moves back to value area, or does it ultimately create a deeper kind of short-term retrace, of which case then you can start looking at 68.50, 68.60. So that's what I'm looking at today, is really the breaker bounce from that value area here, and even from where we are today already, we're at kind of the highs of the day at around 67.90. So you can see here, breakdown into consolidation, short-term break, take the highs, and then moving back into value area. So big question is what happens here at the value area today, around that 67.70 handle. So keep an eye on that one on the S&Ps. In terms of the NASDAQ, it came down. We talked about this 25,200 handle yesterday. That was obviously the prior all-time highs. We got that dive off last night between 11 and 2. So we went from kind of 25.5s down into 25.2s. Symbolically, aggressively moving lower, but creating a V-shaped move. And then, of course, today, what have we seen? We've obviously a period of consolidation. We've broken above the value area, and we're now sitting on that value area. So that 25.4 is pretty much your value area today, to see how does price structure develop, either at and holding above it, or a structural decline back down means price ultimately tries to revisit those pre-market lows. Okay, so that's really a breaker bounce there. Indirectly, in the back end of that is the VIX. So obviously yesterday we talked about this gap higher in the VIX. That's aggressive move lower to try and fill the gap. Ultimately, we didn't. We held about a half a point on the index above it. So around about 17.5, 17.4 is the gap fill. We got to about 18, and then of course we held above 18. We gapped higher again last night, ultimately rejecting. And then of course since then, with the kind of V-shaped movement in the S&Ps, in the NAS, and of course in the European equities this morning, it's allowed for that VIX to kind of move back off that 20 handle that we had really early this morning and move back into that 19 range. So for me, this gap fill pretty much filled. But more broadly beyond that, I want to see how does price structure develop today and see, do we get a little bit of a lean off If we get a lean off, then you're going to see price action move to that 17.5 print, and of course that would allow for the likes of the S&Ps to create a short-term run-up above 67.90 and ultimately try and probably revisit the highs of yesterday at the open or just after the open. That's the cash price open around 68.25, 68.30. Similar type of narrative in the S&P as well, breaking above kind of structural highs of the day, sees price action return to yesterday's value area and even potentially higher into that 25,700 handle. So at least that way we're geared towards understanding what way volatility is presented on the session, reacting accordingly. And if it's a case we don't get a breakdown in the open itself and over the first next kind of 15 to 30 minutes price action gets above 20, well then we know the volatility curve is going to steepen and that should bring in a deeper runoff. So price action breaking below value area and ultimately breaking below value area and moving lower. Okay, so it's just understanding the breaker bounce in terms of the ladders, the sentiment, the volatility, and really kind of then being able to ascertain, right, what way is market pivoting as we progress through the session. So still very early days, not really kind of a whole lot of clarity short term. Obviously the higher trends or the higher time frame trends over the last week speaks for itself, but looking for a little bit more clarity in some of these markets on a directional bias for the session. And incrementally as well on euro dollar, and particularly it's quite interesting this morning that we did break down below the lows of the session. We came back to really this value area here at 14.90. We sold off, we create a new low, we're going back into that 14.90 again. So that for me is going to be a very interesting level. So euro dollar, quite interesting. Cable, really looking to see whether that 130 rolls off. Dollar, very interesting on the breakup, short-term breakup. Interesting to see if there is any sort of kind of a medial retrace, because obviously trend is obviously still bullish. You can even see here equal lows, short-term high, short-term low, short-term high. So even the corrective moves, as again you're looking at that really probably being the base case for any downside dollar price action today. So again, let's see how that plays out. And of course, if the DXY was to break through here, you'd really then expect the VIX to, as I said a moment ago, ultimately break down, try and close this gap, and most likely probably move back into this type of range down here. Okay, so it gives you kind of short-term sentiment on the session, but also looking at that from a risk-weighted perspective as well, from both the risk-denominated assets like your S&P, your NASDAQ, your Dow, and also those other assets like, as I said, your FX, your dollar, etc. Now, gold prices remains continued consolidated. So this is what we talked about last night. It's kind of a whole lot of nothing really when you look at it, just up, down, back down on the dead cat bounce, and then of course marginal new highs, break down, doesn't break through those structural lows. So overall, you'd say this 3900, 3920 handle still holding up nicely, and the short-term highs here. Could it be a case where we develop a period of consolidation like that? Absolutely. Interesting to see what happens here more broadly. On the session 15 minutes structure, quite choppy too. So again, obviously yesterday, short-term sell-off, no real decline during Asia like what we saw in the indices or the global risk assets. So obviously that's quite interesting. Short-term perspective here to trade the range, even on a day trading perspective, you've got obviously value areas up here around 4010, 4020. Peak area here yesterday was 4000. Price action obviously, as we can see, is at highs of the day around 39.83. If we break this, probability is strong probability we come back into here with potential for another move higher back into this. But also as well, you've got trend structure, short-term low, short-term low, short-term low, equal low here, and then of course matching these set of clustered lows with the clustered lows formed last Wednesday. So overall, not really much else to say on gold other than that. And then of course, in the oil space, still remains quite consolidated. No change there from what we talked about last night. UK oil very similar, but again prefer to just focus on US. And then of course moving into the crypto space, BTC got into this 100-101 handle. Nice psychological bounce. Again, similar to what we've seen in the indices. There was a little bit of trepidation this morning, late last night into the close, and then of course during the Asia session, nice little impulse to the downside and then a springboard back up and really holding above this 100-101 handle. So that for me is going to be very interesting as we move into the end of the week to see whether this gives way. And then as well, looking at the weekly perspective, obviously very corrective, but I suppose that 100 is going to be very, very interesting. And I think the weekly close is going to be very, very, very interesting, because they usually say once BTC breaks above or breaks below the 50 week and breaks and closes below the 50 week moving average, that is the end of the trend. We saw it in 2021. We broke through. We continued. We got a little bit of a dead cat bounce, but ultimately that was the end of the trend. We've had a bounce in September. We've had a bounce in March of 2025. So that was September 24. Bounce to 2025 March. And a subsequent retest again in November. So very, very interesting. I still think we've another leg up, but dynamics could change in the next couple of weeks. Particularly, as I said, if it's a case we get kind of a week or a kind of subsequent 2 weeks close underneath. So just be kind of careful on that in the higher time frame perspective. As I said, macro business cycle for me still hasn't peaked. So I'm not really that leaning. I think this is more of a downside shakeout than it is end of cycle. But as I said, we have to be nimble to changing price action dynamics, and of course not always right. So when things go the other way, we obviously have to be able to react accordingly. In terms of Ethereum, we talked about it yesterday, that kind of aggressive breakdown. It continued obviously yesterday evening, and then obviously late last night, aggressive wick. We got a secondary move, but since then we've seen market stabilize between 3.2 and 3.350 on Ethereum. Really interesting. As I said, we could see more declines there on that. Would I like to see a move into 2.829? Yes. Will I get it? Will we get it? Really wait and see, because even when you look a little bit left, that's really the kind of the base case there, right? So you've got a lot of price structure over here holding around that 3,001 handle. We've got above it. We've stayed above it last night. Same again with BTC at 100. We've gone into it, but we've stayed above it. So as I said, next few days very, very interesting in that side of the markets as well. And that's really kind of where we're at today. So as I said, 7 minutes into the open, S&P's apex up, back down, holding above value area. So that's positive. NASDAQ apex up and holding above, but again that could change in the next kind of 10 minutes or so, so really be mindful of that. And then same with the Dow as well. It is really kind of consolidating in here between kind of 47.2. So notably from yesterday's short-term low, you've got a higher low, you've got a short-term lower high, you've lower highs, you've higher lows. So it's really becoming quite clustered in here. So that's really going to be interesting to see what happens with the DAX over the next, as I said, hour or so, to see whether we get a break, retrace, pull back up into those 47 mids, so 47.4, 47.5, 47.6, or whether we ultimately break down, take out this consolidation piece, of which is highlighted here, and ultimately breaking down to the downside for a runoff, as I said, back into some of those deeper zones, so 46.6, 46.7. All right, so that's kind of it for me pretty much at the minute, folks. Nothing too exciting other than that. Really kind of cherry picking opportunities, but obviously looking at short-term vol impacting kind of session to session volatility as well in the back end, and in the back foot seeing how does the dollar play out moving into, obviously, as I said, 3 o'clock. In terms of the calendar, today we're meant to have PMI ISM data at 3 o'clock. Let's wait and see. Obviously still waiting for updates on shutdown. No word really yet, or clarification as of yet on the wires this morning, but obviously looking to see how that develops. And of course we will keep you updated on that. So that's pretty much it, folks, for today. I will be back tomorrow, as I said, looking to see kind of short-term sentiment, how do we react, and then looking at that as we move into 3 o'clock. So I think for me the first 30 minutes is key today, just to get a little bit of clarification, confirmation. I don't mind giving up a little bit more on the entry if it means a bit more clarity on the picture side of things, which creates that idea or viewpoint into obviously close this evening. All right, thanks everyone, cheers, thank you very much.